Welcome to this conversation, which has got a wonderful, I presume it's intended, double entendre title, which is Business Bashing, Should Corporates Care? Which I presume refers both to should businesses care about being bashed, and what should they be doing about that? And secondly, should businesses in general be adopting a more caring, responsible approach to their position within society, and through that perhaps quenching some of the criticisms that they are getting so frequently. So, to introduce the panel, on my left, Stefan Stern. Stefan is a very prolific writer on management issues. He's also a visiting professor at the Cass Business School down the road. He's got a regular column in The Guardian. He's also got a regular column in the FT, and although he's no longer management columnist for the Financial Times, which he did for a long time, he's got a lovely little column called Stern Words, which is hidden away.
Not my idea.
Hidden away.
I agree
Not
to
your
it.
idea. It's
Yeah.
quite nice.
Yeah,
I like
yeah,
it. It's hidden away in the executive appointment supplement, which
Well
many
done.
of you may
Done for
throw
finding
away, but I, for my sins, have a look at. But mainly
Very good, thank you.
mainly for Stefan's great little column. And in fact, this week's was on the topic for today. It was about the responsibility of bankers for what's gone wrong. But anyway, you should look at that. Secondly, on my right here, I've got Professor Rosalind Searle, who for the rest of the time will be known as Ros. Ros is a professor and focusing on organizational development, organizational psychology, and she's a world-recognized expert on trust in organizations. So it's organizational trust is really her thing, and she's conducted many surveys, many studies, written enormously on that subject. Her background, interestingly, is in the motor car industry. She was telling us in the lift on the way up about that, and through that she began to compare, I think, organizational processes and team working, and comparing American and Japanese companies. I think she confirmed that was one of the areas which sparked her interest, and I would say, from what I've seen of what she does on this subject, her passion on the issue of trust in organization. And finally, we've got Mark Sidwell, who is the executive editor for City AM. City AM, for those of you outside London, is a sort of finance-focused daily newspaper, which is distributed here, available online for the rest of you if you haven't come across it. In addition, Mark has authored or co-authored a book on the School of Freedom, a history of liberal education. Mark writes, as well as his executive responsibilities, keeping the business together and more successful, writes a regular weekly column called The Long View in City AM, and that's well noted for its diversity and range of subjects. Just looking at some of the recent ones, he's covered things from the impact of robots in society to the importance of saving the Wedgwood collection, and also the eternal attractiveness or attraction of Doctor Who, and why it's got such a lasting impression. I take the opportunity of introducing Mark also to thank his organisation, his newspaper, City AM, who are one of the media sponsors for the Battle of Ideas, specifically for this session, and more generally for a strand which is running through the day on austerity and economics. And we thank very much City AM for both promoting it. There's a little plug yesterday and other days this week in the newspaper, but for generally supporting the Battle of Ideas. So just a couple of contextual comments or contextual words. I mean, I remember talking to colleagues and others in the business world about a year ago, and at that stage, last autumn, there was a certain sense that perhaps the vitriol of business bashing was a bit on the wane, that things were beginning to tone down a bit. There's an important and highly respected trust barometer from Edelman's, and Edelman was an organization that Stefan used to be an executive director of, I think. And the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is generally where everyone goes to see what's happening to public trust levels in institutions, particularly in business, NGOs, government, the media. It's been running for 14 years, and in the one that was produced at the beginning of this year, it said, that there seemed to be a bit of an upturn, that businesses were less distrusted than they had been at the apogee of the financial crisis in 2009, and things seem to be getting a little bit less critical. I think if you look back, though, over the last 12 months, I think the opposite has really happened. I think what you've seen, I think the most interesting thing that I've seen is that business bashing has become, in a sense, more mainstream and more official. Business bashing is no longer the simple expression of street protesters, of NGOs, or of certain notable left-wing politicians who will have a go at businesses. It's now become very mainstream, and even some quite right-wing individuals have been getting their bashing in against business. I think just to remind ourselves, we've had the whole tax avoidance issues which have come up, where you've had leaders of the Western world, really, from President Obama to George Osborne, basically saying that when it comes to what business is doing for its taxation, it doesn't really matter if they're following the rules, if they're following the law, it's just wrong to avoid taxes. So you've got that at that level with many proposed legislative changes. You've got a bit of a backlash going on for those interested, particularly on the technology world, but I think a lot of the big technology companies over the last year have been bashed quite a bit, from Apple to not least Google have been getting quite a bit of a battering from the European Union, German government, both for the sort of the market dominance of some of these big IT companies from Silicon Valley and from the West Coast of America, but also for their tax policies and also a bit of their lax attitudes, it's claimed, to do with privacy. So the technology businesses, which were a bit of a golden part of the economy, are getting bashed as well. And of course, finally, we've had a continuance and escalation, I would say, of the attacks on the financial institutions. Certainly, we've had this phenomenon which has really been picked up on in the last 12 months of the fines which have been imposed on many large companies. I think the meter, Mark probably knows better than me, but I think the meter of fines on bigger banks is running at about $160 billion since 2009, something like that. And that's covering not just what these banks did or didn't do during the financial crisis, but also claims of money laundering, claims of rate fixing, and so on. And on top of that, we have the discussion both going on in Britain and America and elsewhere about bringing in criminal sanctions against bankers, a theme which, as I say, Stefan talked about this week in his column in the FT. So overall, and many other examples, but overall I'd say it's certainly not the case that business bashing has faded away as time has healed since the financial crisis. And it seems to me that as well as the bark, we have a bit more bite as well, because it is so mainstream now. And I think that's perhaps one of the issues that the panel may want to reflect on. So that's the context. We only have an hour, as I said, so lots and lots to discuss on this. I just want to begin throwing out, and I've asked Stefan to pick up on this, just why is this happening? Not just from the mainstream, but generally, just why has business got such a bad reputation compared to 20 years ago? Does business deserve to be bashed the way it is, or what is it do you think that's driving this?
Well, thanks, Phil, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, business bashers are, employees as well. They're managers, they're consumers, they're people who have an experience of dealing with businesses. So we have to presume in the first instance that people who are bashing business may have some personal motivation in it. As we know, people, it's a cliche, but it's probably true, people join organizations but leave managers, and so if they've had a bad experience at work, they may very well want to bash at least one business in particular, if not others. Well, of course, we've seen, but I don't have to repeat, I don't have to rehearse, the examples of bad behavior. That general sense of, if I can use the phrase, pissed offness with business, the consumer experience, is clearly enough to drive people into bashing. And we've seen the graphs about top pay over the past 20 or 30 years, how rewards at the top have really exploded. Well, certainly over the last 10 years, we know wages have been stagnant or worse. Now that provokes people, most people. Not the people at the top, perhaps, but everybody else. So that's another reason for bashing. We have the whole environmental concern. It's not really a controversial thought that business, under the scrutiny of global media and social media, is going to get bashed quite a lot. the question that the title of this session, should business care? And I'm taking it in the first sense. I mean, should they be bothered? Well, there, of course, the answer is yes and no. Yes, for the reasons that I've just talked about. Good people won't want to join companies, by and large, that have terrible reputations, except perhaps in certain companies or certain sectors. Consumer boycotts may at least temporarily cause you some difficulty, although it's debatable how long those impacts actually last. Clearly, Shell in Brent Spa had a serious problem. Tax and Starbucks temporarily probably had a short-term PR problem. I'm not aware of a lot of Starbucks branches closing or being less crowded than they were. I remember the director of corporate affairs of Nestle saying, not unhappily, that after the campaign against Kit Kats and palm oil, I think you remember with some orangutan fingers, some rather gruesome stuff going on, Kit Kat sales went up by 7%. I think he probably would have welcomed future campaigns of that sort if that's what was going to happen. So, but in the first instance, yes, business should care, but also, do they have to care? If you left planet Earth 10 years ago and come back today and picked up City AM or the FT or consumed other business media, yes, there's quite a lot of gloom about the economic fundamentals. Some of the fines have got a bit bigger, which I fear some businesses just regard as a cost of doing business, no more. But would you say that the tone and the coverage of business in the media has really fundamentally changed in the last 10 years? Would you say that the attitudes of business leaders have, in general, have fundamentally changed? Would you realize that there's been a big financial crisis 6 years ago that we're still trying to get out of? I think that fundamentally might be a reason why there's bashing. Because we said at the time, well, if there's one, you should get a room like this to nod by saying, well, if there's one thing we know about this crisis, that business as usual is impossible. We've got to change the way we do things, and everyone would nod at that point. And then we've been sort of saying things like that for 6 years. It's not clear to me that fundamentally a great deal has changed, and that might also be a provocation to the bashers.
Okay. I mean, you talk about bad behaviour. I mean, do you think there's been a deterioration in behaviour? I mean, is that, or is it just people see it more, or it's more out in the open, or what?
I think it's much more likely to be the latter. I think we just find out about some of these things a bit quicker, and then more yes, and the public, and social media. If you're a global business with an international supply chain, things are happening right now on the other side of the planet that you in headquarters may know, unfortunately, very little about. But people on Twitter or Weibo or whatever it is are going to tell the world about it, and they will find out before you do. And that's a management and a governance problem. But yes, I think we find out quicker. I don't want to talk about apparent golden ages.
Okay. Ros, what's your view? Do businesses deserve this bashing? Has something changed? If it's not moral decline, but are they doing things which deserve to be in the limelight in the way they are?
So my view is that as a trust researcher, we're looking at confidence, but we're also looking at vulnerability. And I think that increasingly consumers are suddenly realizing that they're vulnerable in ways that we have never before seen and never before understood. So if you look at the meat scandal, if you look at the mis-selling of financial products, suddenly things that we haven't had to pay attention to, that we've expected, legitimate businesses to look after us in that respect, we've suddenly realized that no, actually we as consumers have to suddenly be in charge of our legal standing as well. So I think there is a spillover from a whole variety of sectors. We've done a recent meta-analysis where we've looked particularly at financial services and B2B and B2C selling and collected data since 1991. And what we're seeing there is that there are some big changes going on, particularly around regulation, and the impact of regulation is starting to decline because regulators have been unable to put in and have teeth in their regulation. So it's no longer working. And I think that's a really important lesson to come home for businesses, that you can't hide behind a regulator anymore. You have to do something and step up to it. And we're starting to see this with some of the financial services organisations in particular, but I wonder how much of it is greenwashing. I wonder how much of it we're not seeing changes in their performance management systems, for example, and we know that that is driving a lot of the more nefarious practices and the more short-term practices that are hitting consumers.
But given you're saying that, you're saying they're getting around the regulators, but it would seem to me there's a whole lot more regulation in things like food standards or in terms of product standards and so on. So I mean, are you saying that there's still too much of a gap between what the regulators say the way business should be performing and how they are, or do you think there's been an absolute deterioration? Because I think if you look back 50 years or whatever, put in a historical perspective, standards of consumer products or financial services, you can't say that everything was perfect then. There was a lot of chicanery going on.
No, but I think that you assumed that when you went to your supermarket and bought a product, that you wouldn't have to worry about whether it was donkey meat or beef. And, still we have seen no prosecutions of organisations that were knowingly putting food that was unfit for human consumption into a food chain. If you look at fair trade practices, again, there are many organisations that are having the stamp saying fair trade and actually starting to unravel and understand what does that actually mean is starting to come apart. So I think we have to pay attention because as consumers, organisations are very quick to say, here is a stamp that shows how good we are. And now that we're starting to scratch and look behind the surface, I wonder whether it's a brand issue. It's not actually a change in practice. And in particular, in terms of leaders in organisations, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And I wonder for leaders, as a psychologist, there's a term that's called post-conventional cognitive moral reasoning. How many leaders actually are going on courses that are teaching them and getting them to think about the complexity of decision-making and the fact that are you doing something because everybody's watching you doing it, or are you doing it because you genuinely believe from a value system within you that this is the right way to behave?
Still on my theme of do business deserve what's happening? I mean, do you think the business leaders that you're talking about that haven't gone on those courses, are they more mischievous? Are they more out to mislead their customers? Or is it just a more complex world which they're finding it more difficult to negotiate?
I think it's more complex. I think particularly in large organisations, we've been doing a study looking at large public sector organisations and you just realise, the complexity of all the layers. So it's not surprising that you don't necessarily know everything that's going on within your business. But these guys are coming home with huge bonus packets that are kind of they're very happy to take the money of the successes, but they're less likely to take or to have that clawed back from them, or their knighthoods clawed back from them when they're found out to be slightly shady in their dealings. So,
on the subject of clawbacks, I mean, obviously, you're right, that has been a part of the resentment that's gone on there, though, on the other hand, we have seen Fred Goodwin's knighthood clawed back. We have seen the institution of clawbacks into bonuses for banks. In fact, the problem that we have at the moment is the EU is saying, we want to change this, we want to restrict bonuses despite all that clawbacks, which means we're going to end up with a system where there's more pay through allowances, which is actually much harder to claw back. It's important, I think, to see, obviously, transparency is tremendously important. Consumers holding companies to account is tremendously important. New businesses reacting to those dissatisfactions and creating new businesses is important. Regulation has its place. We have to understand that it can cause problems. It's very hard to get right. It's just as hard to get right as it is for the people running the company. Another example, you were talking about the horse meat scandal. Now that's at least in part. It's a very difficult position for the companies, obviously, because they have consumers who want really cheap products. That's why Tesco is very successful. 45p for a loaf of white bread is an incredible thing. That's really good for people on lower incomes, and they like it for those reasons. But at the same time, they don't want low-quality products. But there was a regulatory change which meant that you didn't have to screen for DNA anymore. And that, of course, set a flaw that most people followed. But you do see companies who are paying attention to their brands in a competitive way, going beyond that. And then Sainsbury's was a very good example. They did, and have been for about 10 years, I think, DNA testing, despite the fact that it wasn't required by regulatory reasons. And as a result, their brand was much protected. And of course, I'm sure this is all fed into the continuing problems we see with Tesco today, which is, despite still being very dominant in the market, looking increasingly shaky. So I think it's important to see that regulation is by no means an easy response and sometimes can cause some of the problems. And to see these hard problems that the companies are facing, because they are, of course, serving the public. They are trying to give the public what the public wants. And in a market system, there's a lot of feedback there. And when you have these conflicting demands, it's very difficult. I think what happened with the supermarkets was, in part, there was a sense own brand products was a great way to get good margins. And people like Tesco, some of the others, didn't think enough about how much of their brand they were putting on the line if they didn't look at the quality of those products in the way that Sainsbury's did. But these are hard decisions.
Okay, Mark. Both Stefan and Ros, highlighted the point about income disparities. I mean, there does seem to be something going on. I mean, you may meet more than most of us do in terms of through your job. But when you see the amount of money which senior execs are paying themselves, and it is broadly paying themselves,
being paid through
their
remuneration committees, so not really paying themselves as such,
But when it does go up from, I think the IDS put out figures this week that for the UK it was from 47 times a CEO gets compared to the average worker in 2000, and it's now 120 times. I mean, that's quite a big jump over the course of 15 years. And you do tend to think then, are these people, a bit detached from, the rest of us and what's going on in society, that they are prepared to pay themselves so much and therefore risk the criticism which Stefan and Ros have highlighted?
Like I say, I think it's slightly unfair to say pay themselves. It's the companies that are choosing to pay them. And of course, if you look at the difference someone at the top can make, it can be extraordinary. You can see, Chris Bailey coming in at Burberry, or a really problematic CEO like they had at Tesco until recently, and you can see massive movements in the share price reacting. So they're not just sort of blindly doing this. They're doing this because there are billions of dollars at stake, and we all know through our own lives the difference that individuals can make. The good teacher, the friend or the person at work who adds more quality than you could reasonably expect from someone in that position. There's just exceptionally, people can make a real difference. I think the reason we worry about it more, though, is straightforward. And the reason why business bashing is sort of on the agenda is, we've had this huge recession. The economy is growing, but it's still in a very bad place. Real wages have been going down, or certainly squeezed and low for a very long time, historically. And tax revenues aren't where they were. And so people are looking at where they can get more money, and they see corporations sitting there, and they think maybe that, and they see other people with money. What we need, though, is the growth. We need to get that return to a pie that's getting bigger, rather than just trying to slice different bits off what we think of as easy targets. And the real danger is if, by doing that, we constrain our ability to grow more. Because what you really want is the economy booming in such a way that there is plenty of tax revenue or whatever as there was before.
So some of the business execs are being scapegoated a bit for broader economic problems, which we're all suffering to some extent.
As we suffer that, it's understandable that we might look there, but resentment may not be the most constructive response. And of course, as I say, the market's a responsive place. If there is some bizarre groupthink going on where all these companies are wasting money on chief execs that they really don't need, that they could just get someone who they could pay a fraction of that, then someone's going to come up with a company that does that. And that might be some of the tech things. I mean, I think Stefan was saying, has anything really changed? I think one of the things at the moment for finance, certainly that I see, they're small now, but there are all these extraordinary, innovative companies who, if you don't like the big financial companies, you can go and look at peer-to-peer lending, you can go and look at, crowdfunding to get businesses started. When the gaps start to appear, when these banks can't lend to you, and partly for regulatory reasons again, there are now new opportunities coming up and smaller companies with flatter structures. Okay. I'm not entirely convinced that haven't got such valuable leaders either, but it's very different.
Okay,
well,
Stefan?
I absolutely agree with you about growth, and that's clearly what we need to look for. So the question is there a systemic problem that is preventing growth from happening? There are lots of numbers offered up about how much cash UK corporates are sitting on and not investing. We see them doing share buybacks and so on, but that's a kind of admission that you don't necessarily know what else to do with your money. You're just keeping the share price up. Something that Andrew Smithers has written about in his book, The Road to Recovery, and he's no lefty, he wouldn't mind me saying, is this systemic bad incentive problem for top management, that if they are set targets related to the share price, there is an incentive to them to do things to the company over the short to medium term that get the share price up without necessarily investing what is required for the long-term growth of their organizations in terms of research and development, product development, and so on. I think that is a serious problem. That's, in a way, the real reason to be cross about top pay, not just because they're very big numbers, and I agree with Mark that sometimes exceptional and extraordinary leaders do deserve fantastic rewards if they lead a transformation of a business or a development of a new market or so on. But really we need people leading these organizations to be thinking 10, 15, 20 years ahead, not, I've got 3 years in this job. If I can get the share price up to a certain number in the short term by doing things that the short-term money in particular in the markets likes, then I'm really going to hit the jackpot. And I really don't mind what happens to the organization after I've gone. I think that's a really worrying systemic problem. That's getting into some of the territory that Ros was talking about, whether there has been a kind of moral slippage, I'm afraid, from... I said I wasn't going to talk about golden ages, but there was a time when we used to have these characters, and journalists love them, called captains of industry, and corporations were rather steadier and more stable and perhaps slightly more long-termist organizations than they are today. And that looks perhaps rather attractive seen from today, executives who are thinking longer term and about the well-being of the whole organization and indeed its contribution to society, not just profits and shareholders.
But on that point then, doesn't that contradict a bit what you're saying, that you haven't seen much has changed? Because it seems a lot of business leaders now, leave aside the pay for a moment, but a lot of business leaders, I think, are very genuine and sincere in seeing their need for social responsibilities. The CSR codes, sure, when they were introduced 20 years ago, they were about reputation management and a bit of sort of defensiveness, and there was elements of greenwash as people described it then. It does seem now there's much more buying into the whole idea of sustainability and the need for social responsibility. It seems to me comparing attitudes to the business impact on society today compared to, say, in the early 1990s, it is qualitatively different. There has been a change.
Well, the quality of the language has changed. The question is, has the quality of the actions changed? I know of one FTSE 100 CEO who, when the phrase CSR comes up, acts out playing a violin. And there's a real problem with CSR.
Maybe an older generation, perhaps, no?
Perhaps. There's a real problem with CSR if it is sort of added on like a sort of spray job, like a sort of added extra. Really, I don't think corporations should have CSR departments, ideally. I think, they should think about how they're making money and think about how they behave and be responsible in that broader sense, rather than saying, oh, and there's Reg and he does the ethics bit. I don't think that's a very good way to go ahead.
So it's not really been taken on board in a systemic sense across a business?
I think some companies, I'm generalising, of course. Of course, there are some companies that are very serious about this. I would mention Unilever in that context. They really thought very, very hard. And the CEO drives the organisation incredibly hard. He wants them to double their financial performance while halving their impact on the planet. That is really hard.
And I'm sure the way that he does that is through performance management systems. To pick up something Mark said about people changing how they're using banks, for example, I think predominantly those will be young people. And I think young people are one of the key areas that have really suffered over recent years. And you look at the rise of internships that are only really open to people who have a financial parent who's able to back them, or in terms of looking at apprenticeships. 20 years ago, there were apprenticeship models. My background is motor industry. We had an apprenticeship school that you put young people through, and you saw that as your responsibility to train and educate young people. Young people across the world are twice as likely as their adult counterparts to not have work. They're, including students coming out with very good qualifications, much more likely to be underemployed in organisations that they could do so much more from, but they're not being offered these opportunities. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention to the wasted generations of talent. So you talk about increasing the size of the pie, that's about bringing young people on in different ways, and we're just not seeing that. We're not seeing a whole suite of different businesses recognising that they have to do something about that, because otherwise there will be a lost generation that are going to be financially dependent and probably have long-term medical issues as a result of the psychological problems of wagelessness and also unemployment.
So why do you think that is? Why is there not that investment in the future of skills and the future of young people?
Because we had a whole suite of different programmes that we put forward to liberate firms from this, and they have taken full advantage of it. And reduce their bottom line that, apprenticeship schools cost money. And if you don't have to do it, then why should you do it? You look at many of the apprenticeship schemes coming through, those aren't going to people outside the organisations, those are not going to minority group members, they're going to people who are already employed in those organisations. They're often going to people who are 40. Sorry, that's not a youth scheme, is it?
Indeed. I mean, I agree with you about apprenticeships, and I think there is quite a lot going on, certainly in London. I think the Mayor of London's been involved in that. We have a young apprentice that we had in our company, and she's been very good from a minority, funnily enough, and she's been great, and we've kept her on and turned her into a proper employee. Of course, it's a tiny anecdote, but I think there's lots of that going on. Just on the sort of short-termism, long-termism thing, obviously there's a huge variety in business, and we shouldn't just sort of get obsessed by imagining it's all some uniform thing. Obviously, there aren't just listed businesses where people are worrying about the share price. There are private ones and family companies and so forth as well. So it's worth saying that. And of course, business models are again evolving in the market all the time. There might well be problems with some short-termism around the share price, but it's very hard to think long-term. I mean, politicians are awful at it, as we know. They're just looking for the next election. We're very bad at it too. It's quite hard to discount, future costs in terms of personal immediate desires. That's why the government's so interested in nudging at the moment, though it's doubtful they're much good at that either. Businesses actually are surprisingly good at long-term thinking. They're one of the better ones we have in terms of things like oil exploration, pharma, developing medicines. You've got to think on really long time scales, decades. They are doing investment. Now, we might argue about whether it's perfect and whether around the edges we could do more, but they are long-term thinkers, and we should be glad of that, because that's an extremely hard thing to find.
Don't you think that's changed, though? As one of those things, again, trying to put some history into it, I mean, it does seem that businesses were investing much more for the long term. Again, not talking about golden ages, but, there was for a long period a lot more business investment of 5, 10, 15 years. And Possibly. It does seem that even if you look at those oil companies and so on, they are cutting back their spending on the exploration.
Well, but then we've seen the extraordinary growth of shale fracking, which is a remarkable innovation which required a lot of hard and ingenious thought. I know it's controversial, but it's completely transformed the US energy economy. Obviously, we're still looking at the possibilities here, but given the energy security problems we have and the likelihood of lights going out potentially quite soon, these are not unimportant areas. There's a lot of innovation in digital and tech and so forth. Pharma is a huge problem. I think we have run out of innovation in pharma, and again, that's partly regulatory. It's become incredibly expensive to do. But yeah, I mean, that's an area where we desperately need more innovation.
Okay, opportunity for comments.
I wanted to tackle this from the point of view of businesses, because I think an issue that the panel haven't engaged with really is the inability or reluctance of people to own businesses and take responsibility for businesses anymore. So businesses are largely built on debt and not equity. And the K review looked in detail at how an increasingly narrow base of ownership of that equity and an increasingly foreign base of ownership of that equity meant that those business owners, eventual business owners, have real difficulty in establishing any control over business. And I think that's why we have a massive bonus culture, because, the captains of industry, your old captains of industry, would have owned industry. And these days they don't own industry at all, and so they have to be measured by performance measurement, by CSR checklists, by bonuses, and that's because of a real crisis of ownership. And I do think that the fact of nobody taking responsibility is what does lead. I think there has been a reduction in the level of behaviour in businesses, and it's because people aren't taking responsibility, because they no longer own businesses.
I do kind of worry when we talk about, seemingly kind of educational courses for business people, in the sense that, when you kind of look at a business, I mean, the only CEO I think I can name is admittedly someone who doesn't know all too much about this. The only kind of brave character I could sort of look to is a sort of courageous CEO who tests out his opinions with his customers, not in kind of his share prices seemingly, or focus groups, is the CEO of Ryanair, who seems to be quite brazenly happy to say, sometimes I don't care all too much about my customers. But ultimately he's at least putting that up to the decision of customers, like it might not be kind of a textbook case, but I mean, isn't there kind of some sense that if you start, prescribing courses for how you do business, then you kind of take off some of those rough edges that actually might encourage people to, reinvestigate how they engage with companies rather than just brands.
You mentioned companies like KitKat, the brand, or Starbucks, not necessarily being damaged financially from all the negative stories. With the increase of social media, do you think that will change in the future?
My question is really about the bad behaviour, and it's about the perception, the widely held perception that people get away with it. And I'm talking about individuals here who might hide behind the corporation. And I guess you could look at the horse meat scandal and certainly the foreign exchange scandal, manipulation of benchmarks, which I've been looking at fairly recently, and talking to some of the people who took part in that. They have no perception really that what they did was wrong. And so we're looking at, if it's systemic in the organisation and the individuals can't see that it's wrong, how do you, through regulation or otherwise, how do you stop that perception among the public that A, nobody's getting punished for it directly, no bankers go to jail, and B, how does the organisation come out and say, yes, we did wrong, not just we settled and we paid a huge fine, which is usually what happens.
Thank you, very useful. And I think that sort of theme as to whichever way you're reflecting on what's happening at the moment, but how businesses should be responding to an obvious perception. And are some doing right things, or some making things worse, or whatever, is a good theme for our last 20 minutes or so. But anyway, take the panel and then take another bunch of questions. So, okay. Stefan?
I think the ownership point is extremely important. You may have seen the work that a think tank called Tomorrow's Company has done about this whole concept of stewardship. We used to have, again, slightly romantic, but we used to have this sort of long fund, and even the long funds, time horizon seems to have reduced a bit. When Cadbury's was being targeted by Kraft, we wrapped it in a Union Jack, but it turned out that more than half its shares were held in the US, and that certainly only 10% or less of its turnover was in the UK, and so there's a sort of nationality and identity problem there. But I basically agree that ownership is a fascinating and important area to look at. An academic from Harvard Business School told me that 2 years after the Harvard MBA, unfortunately, the students emerge narrower and less interesting than when they arrived. And so there's something in what you say about rough edges being smoothed off, and we really want, and I work a bit at Cass around the corner, you really want people to emerge broader and deeper and richer and intellectually when they emerge from business school, not narrower. So I think there's something interesting in that. Of course, social media, this is what's so scary for corporations. I hinted at it because, this is basically great. It's democratizing that citizens can speak up, and that's what's scary, that you don't know, this famous sort of tipping point idea, you don't know when a campaign will really take off and have impact or not. So the answer is behave better in the first place. And Leslie's point is fascinating, the sort of moral relativism and the slide. And it sometimes, I think, ill-behaved journalists, famous for their behaviour on expenses, to criticise others on moral slippage. But of course, that's how things happen, bit by bit, and it becomes a norm. And senior executives can't even keep up with what people on the trading floors are doing. They don't even know. They don't even understand it. And this is very difficult because you want to hire clever, fast-moving, aggressive, competitive people who want to make money in those bits of the organisation. So this is a really difficult one. And you've probably seen some of the work that Joris Luyendijk did on the Guardian banking blog. He's an ethnographer, really, anthropologist, philanthropic also, but anthropologist, talking to amazing stories he's been told from the trading floors. Also, the whole business of auditing is another story altogether. When the auditors are in the building and you can't tell who's staff and who's the auditor. And so obviously I'm not answering your question, but I'm responding to it. It's really difficult. That's my revelation. It's really difficult.
Yeah, sure. So many things. I'm slightly uncomfortable with the idea that there's something unsavory about foreign capital. To me, it seems, the economy is in a bad enough state that's we should be very grateful that we have certain areas that are pulling in foreign money. It's part of the thing that's keeping us going, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The same incentives are at play, and in fact, if you look at the FTSE, obviously you're looking at companies with all sorts of foreign assets elsewhere in the world rather than foreigners owning stuff. In the UK, social media, is clearly a huge thing. I use it myself, and I get annoyed with horrible service when airlines lose my bags, and it's very useful. Mind you, companies adapt to everything, and I'm slightly uncomfortable with the idea that the few people who are very powerful on social media, and it is a few who are more powerful than most, will start to get sort of special treatment through companies like Clout, which is a sort of social media thing. So, I mean, everything evolves. Ryanair is an interesting example. Now, Ryanair is now moving into budget business travel, which EasyJet has also recently done. And O'Leary, famously acerbic, has stepped back and said, I'm going to let people sort of talk a little more smoothly to the business guys. I think it's always interesting how people are adapting to the opportunities they see in the market and changing their tone of voice to do that. Obviously, being so aggressive was a very good way of saying to people, look, it's horrible, but it's cheap. That's what you want. It was a very effective piece of branding. In general, people worrying about the cultures in companies, and I think that is tremendously important. And I think the idea of virtue, of thinking within, the limits of the law and the limits of what the constraints of your company are tremendously important. And it's something that's about the culture that you build in an organization, and that does matter. I mean, one of the businessmen that I admire the most, I think, is David Ogilvy, great sort of father of advertising. And if you read his writings, it's very moving. He's tremendously astute, writes very, very well. And he has this tremendous sense, even though he's in advertising, which, is always a sort of dirty profession in some ways, of, thinking about it in a sort of wider context of, would you be ashamed to do this? And really standing back from it. So I take a lot from that, and I think that's something I try to build in my organisation, and I think it's important for all organisations to bear in mind.
That's a really important point. I just wanted to quickly add, on the top pay point, I once said to John Monks when he was leading the TUC, can you shame people? And he said, well, how do you shame shameless people? And if the shame mechanism is broken down, then it's difficult to know. Then I'm afraid sort of dead regulation does get slapped down with unintended consequences.
But of course, whether you should automatically be ashamed of high pay, I mean,
Not
this is
necessarily.
That's another
different question. Yeah.
Ros?
I think there's some interesting issues around how an organisation sets a tone in different ways. And certainly we've been doing some work looking at the notion of trust change. So could you actually change an HR system within an organisation so that you identified and selected people who were maybe more ethically engaged, and therefore you were less likely to get the problems that we've seen? What we know is, we do a lot of work in the financial services, but also in the oil industry. These are organisations that give their staff phenomenal amounts of money. You only have to go to Aberdeen to realise that you're in a different part of the world, because the standard car there is an Audi, not a Ford. So what we've identified there is that they could do more in terms of selecting people, but also you can identify weak apples in an organisation. You can identify weak situations in which people are much more likely to follow the pack. And largely economists, I'm a psychologist, largely economists have said, well, if you look at the cost-benefit analysis people do not do a cost-benefit analysis. They look at the prevailing trends. They look at whether somebody gets away with something, and then they follow suit. I'm sorry, but we are naive to think of anything else. And so the moral tone of your establishment is set by your managers, and it's set by the top of the organisation. A comment was made to me the other week, which was around, if you want the best selection systems, go and talk to the car park attendant. Because they'll tell you who parks in the disabled spot, and they'll tell you who bashes into other people's cars and doesn't leave a note. They have a very good insight into who's behaving well in organisations and who's not. And I think we really need to step up and start looking at this, rather than saying it's not our fault. We do have performance management system that incentivise people to play the system for their own gain and to not think about the consequences. I'm sorry, it's naive to look at anything else. People are trained, very sadly, in business schools. If you look at what goes on, as you said, people enter a business school and they learn how to cheat.
So what's your proposals then? So you see this, I mean,
Not
you
Cass
agree
Business School.
with Stefan?
There's no cheating module at all.
Not Coventry
That is-
Business School, but
No,
I think
not the
there's a
ones you
lot-
know, but all the other ones who train people to be shameless and stuff.
Well,
So
we train people about what are the ways that they will be rewarded, and then we are surprised that they behave in those ways. You know, we're intelligent beings, so...
don't you think it could be that all the schools are really trying to do the same thing as Coventry and Cass? And that, you know, there are other factors out there which are perhaps
Well, I think often...
leading to this impression?
I think often what business schools don't do is think about what organisations want and need and develop curriculum that are tied into what organisations really need from leaders in the future. And I think sadly, and it kind of links into your bit about social media, we've been trained to apologise, and I can just say sorry and carry on doing what I've been doing. You know, I have a 10-year-old, and we spend a long time talking to her about just saying sorry isn't good enough. And I think sadly in businesses, many people are saying sorry and they're not doing anything to
and
change.
they say, I'm sorry if anyone was upset.
Right,
They
okay.
develop the sorry. You know. If you foolishly were offended by my brilliant comments, I'm very sorry about that.
But it goes back to the bit
Okay.
that we were saying right at the start, you know, then we wonder why the public start bashing. You know, hello?
I'm wondering if the discussion would be any different if it was entitled Holding Business to Account rather than business bashing. And then a sort of naive question, what would be the business and the social implications if there was a requirement to have an agreed ratio between top pay and bottom pay within an organisation?
I worked for a large international oil company for 30-odd years, and I asked the question of our retail people, would anything stop them selling alcohol at retail sites? And the answer was, well, as long as it's legal, we'll do it. I think values, morals have gone out of the window. I think I was very struck by a comment made, I think, the new head of Barclays, or it may have been the previous one. He was asked if he knew anything about the founders of the company. They were Quakers. He didn't.
I'm really interested in this kind of vacuum of values in business, which I suppose is not entirely surprising. The problem is what we do about it. We bash, as citizens, we bash politicians because we think that they're unrepresentative and remote. So it's not surprising that we bash corporations, particularly the huge global corporations, which are way beyond our reach. I mean, thinking about Google, which originally was wonderful because it gave us things, and it gave us things for free. Now it takes them away because it's got that kind of power that is beyond the consumer and beyond the government. But what I found really depressing was the comment right at the beginning of this session that after the notoriety that Starbucks attracted, its sales seemed to go up. Now, surely, if it's difficult for us as consumers to rein in Google, it is possible for us to boycott Starbucks. The question is, or two questions, how do we rein in global corporations? And how, as citizens, do we activate ourselves, we go beyond complaining about the values or lack of them of corporations and think about our own values and the kind of actions that we can take to rein in businesses where there is competition, where we do have choice, and therefore we do have a little power.
Okay.
I have one question concerning the fair trade bit that you mentioned right in the beginning.
Fair trade, yeah.
Yes, because as I interpreted or learned a little bit about it was that it started off in small organizations and in small businesses which were really committed to high standards. The mainstream took over and the standards got lower, but the reach got increased. So, and I think that's a phenomenon that you often observe in when mainstream takes over and incorporates a radical view. And I was wondering if you think that this greenwashing is bad because it de-radicalizes issues or good because it increases the reach?
I think we can probably all agree that we would like companies to do as much social good as possible and as little social harm as possible. And I think the companies themselves would agree with that, and I think the businessmen in them would agree with it too. What strikes me about the whole regulation discussion is the extent to which it is necessary but insufficient. And you've given a few examples which I think highlight the point. In the opening comments, we spoke about corporation tax and the extent to which politicians shame companies into paying corporation tax, in effect tacitly admitting that we don't have the legal instruments at our disposal. You've got more money available. You can hire the big accountants, the big lawyers, and we struggle to keep up with you. And so what we'll do instead is we'll embarrass you. We'll embarrass you into paying tax. The executive pay one we've talked about at some length. And it occurs to me that the whole executive pay discussion is quite fascinating, because the question in my mind is this not the march of unintended consequences arising from regulation and arising from transparency? And so if we talk about a ratio having gone from 48 to 1 to 120 to 1, and we talk about shaming the executives, forget it, because that's the market rate of pay. Why did we not shame the executives at a rate of 48 to 1? You could shame a person at a rate of 20 to 1. What justifies you earning 20 times more than another person? So I think, and the most recent regulations around things like executive pay too, I think we will discover 2 or 3 years hence, have also failed. So I think regulation as an instrument will always be a partial answer. And so I guess the question in my mind is, systemically, clearly, we have to go beyond regulation. Clearly, systemically, we have to rely on instruments outside regulation. We have to rely on, to a degree, the media, to a degree, consumers. But I think the notion that we're somehow less moral than we ever were is wrong-headed. I think people are people, and they've always been people, and they're always going to be equally moral. And it's just the nature of the beast.
A couple of quick comments from me on that. I mean, on the tax avoidance side, you imply that the state isn't powerful enough to impose the laws. I mean, I think we have to recognize there's a little bit of double talking going on here, because there is a tremendous amount of tax competition between states in the corporation tax area. And there's a bit of a, oh, we didn't know we were giving so many tax perks on the one hand to, you should be paying more tax on the other. But I think you make a very good point on the transparency on the executive pay side. But I think it's generally well known now in corporate governance circles that it was the imposition of regulations to have to report on executive pay in the 1990s, which led to a situation which actually created a spiral upwards, because no one wanted to be seen to be paying their chief executive bottom of the rank or in the bottom quarter. Everyone wanted to be in the top quartile, and I've sat on boards where that happens. And so by the nature of things, and if everyone's going for the top quartile, lo and behold, it has a certain self-fulfilling prophecy there.
The session's about should corporates care. Two groups we haven't talked much about are employees and the relationship of that to the welfare state. There's increasing talk in the NHS of a larger role for employers in promoting effective public health and particularly mental health, actually. Been some real innovation, BT and others, real innovation there. In fact, the chief executive of NHS England at the moment lost 3 stone in the US because of his own employee incentive program to lose weight. So I'm interested in should corporates care about their employees and how that impacts on the welfare state.
There's a lot of talk about ethics, and I was just wondering, I suppose the very motion appeals to the fact there's some sort of objective morality. But I was wondering, is it not a good thing that businesses do so-called wrong things and actually challenge the system, and that produces a far better society than one where we all conformed and we wouldn't be having these discussions?
Where do you think this leaves the kind of Adam Smith principles? Because he spoke about businesses kind of going for their own aims and that in turn benefiting society, whether you think this doesn't apply anymore because businesses are too self-centered.
Okay, and I'm going to throw another question in for me as well. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the sort of shamelessness of chief execs and so on, and that they are, manipulating rules and going around rules. I mean, there's also a sense in which I see business leaders keeping their heads down, and I'm being somewhat defensive in response to this climate. And that was one of the points made in Mark's column in City AM yesterday. I think he referenced Osborne saying it's about time business leaders stood up a bit more and put their head above the parapet and actually argued that businesses do play anyway a positive social role in society. They produce goods and services that, regardless of the standards discussion we're having, that people enjoy. They increase productivity. They have overall a positive impact on society. And perhaps business leaders should, if they want to abandon their shamelessness, should actually get up and argue the positive benefits for business. So I wondered what the panel had to think about that as well. Okay, so thank you all very much for your comments from the floor. And we'll take Rolls first, I guess. Yeah, and then Mark, and then Stefan.
I was on a platform a couple of weeks ago with one of the main, a guy called Mark Swan, who's the main regulator for the Civil Aviation Authority. And what was so refreshing in the conversations we were having with him, and it was in an oil and gas platform. Well, he was talking about how they, as regulators, are stopping helicopters flying into the North Sea when the waves are too high, that they know that if there's an accident, they will be unable to save anybody on that helicopter. And also, the survival kits that you have to wear mean that now there are an increasing amount of spaces on that helicopter because people will not be able to get out of the doors in the kit that they have to wear. And what he was talking about was working very closely with industry to say, this is what we want you to do, and we will shut down your ability to fly to the platform. So basically, we will shut down the North Sea if you do not play what we're asking you to do, but then working with the organisations to get them to think about what the consequences and what were some solutions. And by having this real exchange as a regulator, he was saying very clearly, I have teeth and this is why I'm doing it. But also it was allowing businesses to enter into that dialogue and really come up with some different solutions and different ways of thinking that was impacting not just on the aircraft operators, but also on the businesses themselves. And that kind of interconnected thinking, I think, was so refreshing to see from a regulator looking through. And what really strikes me increasingly, and we've been doing a whole lot of studies looking at where do people get their identities from? Is it from their careers? Or is it from the teams that they work very closely in? Or is it from the organisation and that big brand? And what we're seeing is you get this kind of split so that it is about their careers and their careers driving, because they feel that no longer can they allow an organisation to look after them. You know, and again, as was said right at the beginning, I became interested in trust because I came into doing my PhD looking at innovation in teams, and I watched a large-scale American automotive manufacturer who had systematically taken out their bottom line by making older engineers redundant, and they put them into a consultancy. And so for them, they had saved all that money, but what they'd failed to realise, just being around the offices of these people, these were guys who had given their lives to this firm and who were at the peak of their abilities in terms of understanding the full impact. And instead of being there 24/7, which they had been in the past, suddenly they were deciding that they wanted to play golf on a Friday and that they were going to manage their retirement because the business had really showed to them that it didn't actually care about them. And I think this is the kind of worry that I have, that businesses are failing to understand the consequences. They're understanding the bottom line, but they're not understanding the values and those wider messages. You know, we've shown systematically that trusted organisations do impact on your bottom line because you get more high-quality citizenship behaviour where people are going that extra mile for you, and you get less counterproductive work behaviour, you get less theft. We just have to think differently about it so that caring makes a difference.
Thank you very much, Ross. Mark?
Yeah, a couple of quick technical things and then something more general. So pay ratios, an attractive idea, much more complicated in practice because obviously businesses are structured differently. So you might have a business that has a lot of people who the market rate is quite low and they're adding relatively small amounts of value to the business, perhaps like a cleaning company, and then has a management layer. Or you might have companies like Facebook or something where you've got a lot of programmers who the market rate is incredibly high and they're adding huge amounts of individual value. So the ratios are going to be reflecting that. So a universal one isn't really going to work. But again, I would say look at innovation. There's a guy called Paul Thomas, the business doctor, Welsh academic, and he's doing work on trying to create companies where you take out the management layer, you go back to a more foreman-led system, which again is like an innovative way of leveling and making these companies flatter, which means you're not paying necessarily those high management costs. It's much more efficient for the companies. To the extent that that works, it'll obviously catch on. On the subject of corporation tax, much harder, again, or much more complicated than it seems. Corporation tax overall, revenues are going up. Across the OECD, they've been going up for decades. So in that sense, it's not like the money's all disappearing. We can worry about it at the edges, but the real thing about corporation tax is you have to worry about the incidence, which is who is actually paying the corporation tax. Corporations don't pay the tax. There are two candidates for who pays corporation tax. One of them are the owners of the capital, the people who own the shares in the company, maybe getting less dividends and lower share prices. And the other people are the people who are employed by the company. Now, there is considerable economic debate about this, but there is no doubt that wages are affected by high corporation tax. It's partly why US has a very high corporation tax. It's because it's a stealth way of taxing the population that they don't really notice. It's somewhere between 30% and up to 70% of corporation tax is paid by the wages. So you have to bear that in mind. It's not necessarily just going to get a nice fat hit on the shareholders if you're worried about that. In general, and someone mentioned Adam Smith, there has been a bit of sort of the worst possible construction being put on business. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the business I see. And we have to remember both that business, by supplying things that we want, is doing good, whether or not, whatever rate of corporation tax it's paying. It exists because it's providing these really useful voluntary services that we like and pay for. And also there is this idea of douce commerce. It's an idea that was very popular in the 17th century. You can find it earlier in the 12th century in Hugh of St. Victor. The idea that by engaging in these voluntary acts of commerce, we actually make ourselves nicer people, more polite, more able to trade with strangers, more trusting in some ways. And I think that's still a valuable theory, and it's worth thinking about that. Commerce brings people together. It does a lot of good, and we shouldn't always put the worst constructions on what's going on behind the corporate facade.
Thank you, Mark. And Stefan.
Right, I'll do one line on each of those questions. So, yes, holding to account, I like the language, and I think ratios, yes, worth exploring, certainly. Point about legal versus ethical, there was a director of Hewlett-Packard many years ago who said, we will play by the rules. We think we can win at any game that you ask us to play, but we will play by the rules. And Eric Schmidt at Google also said, if you change the tax code, we will comply with it. So legality has something to do with governments and regulators being brave enough to put effective and sensible, but effective regulation in place. Reining in global corporations, probably in this room 20 or 30 years ago, there were a lot of people who wouldn't bank with Barclays because of South Africa. It takes something really, really big to get people coordinated, engaged in that way. And after a few weeks of being cross with Starbucks, maybe just go back if you like them, I'm afraid. People aren't engaged enough. Fair trade, yes, got diluted clearly. Again, regulation is no answer. Effective regulation, intelligent regulation is how these benchmarks have to be policed. And transparency, yes, I take that point absolutely. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. Look at if you ever go to San Gimignano in Tuscany, the towers got higher and higher as people wanted to be the biggest one in town, just like in Manhattan. Health and the employer. Paternalism, incredibly unfashionable. The benign employer. But the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 talks about the duty of care. It's more old-fashioned language, if you like. The duty of care of the employer to the employee, and also of the employee to him or herself and to each other. Duty of care, ladies and gentlemen. Worth thinking about. Ethics, I take your point, but you reminded me of, it is obviously a slippery slope. You reminded me of a book that came out of BCG, the consulting firm, a few years ago, called Hardball. Clues in the title, and at one point they refer to the moral grey area that is so rich in possibility. I think that's a pre-crash publication. Adam Smith, we should all reread Adam Smith, and I think he has been introduced. He was a moral philosopher, of course, really, not an economist at all. Defense of CEOs, yes, they should get up and speak. I think Osborne is right about that. We should be. I don't like endless, unthinking business bashing, even though I've been a bit rude myself. Business is a wonderful, important thing. Creating jobs, products and services that we need, employing us. The public sector's stretched. If we want better jobs, the private sector is probably going to be the place they come. My last thought is if Mr. Osborne does want business to speak up a bit more loudly, when he hears what they think about his position on the European Union, I think he might be a bit disappointed.
Okay, can we please thank our panellists?